Hello, welcome to the 2021 Urban Tree Festival. My name's Packman. I'm one of the organisers of the Urban Tree Festival, and I'll be your host for this afternoon. The Urban Tree Festival is a celebration of all things urban trees, their benefits and their beauty, their majesty and their magic. The festival seeks to connect tree lovers and tree newcomers alike to their local urban trees, connecting people to each other and to share tree knowledge far and wide. The festival runs until Sunday the 23rd, so we're now into the final weekend, with a wide range of fantastic and inspiring events. These events you can find out on our event listing on our website, and there should be a link to that coming up in the chat box. The festival is run and organised by a group of volunteers, and although we're very kindly supported by organisations such as the Woodland Trust, Greater London Authority, CPRE London and Trees for Cities, we are very reliant upon donations to help us deliver the festival. So a really, really big thank you to anyone who has donated, because it helps us immensely in order to run the festival and deliver it, and also to help pay some of our contributors. But if anyone would like to, then there should be a link coming up in the chat. So this session today is part of our daily Tree Rings webinar series. The Tree Rings webinar series is curated by CPRE London, the countryside charity working for a greener city. The webinars aim to explore a series of contemporary tree issues, and today's webinar is part of our focus on ancient trees. With previous events, such as last Sunday, where we had an event called The Wonder of Ancient Trees, and on Tuesday, we had a brilliant workshop on how to identify and record ancient and veteran trees onto the Woodland Trust Ancient Tree Inventory. All of those are on our YouTube channel. That's just Urban Tree Festival on YouTube. You can subscribe and watch our events as they're put on there. But we also have 2 webinars left of our Tree Rings webinar series for the festival. Tomorrow we have a really fascinating discussion. It's a philosophical discussion on what is the value of trees. That should be a really interesting one. That's tomorrow at 1 p.m. And again, there should be a link in the chat where you can book onto the webinars. And then on Sunday at 3 p.m, we have one on campaigning for trees, which has become much more of a contemporary important issue. So on to today's event. I'm very excited to introduce our speakers for today. First up is David Humphries, the award-winning David Humphries, winning last year's London Tree Officers Individual Commitment Award from the London Tree and Woodland Awards, who is Tree Management Officer up at Hampstead Heath, having started off as an apprentice up at the Heath 36 years ago. And also Dr. Peter Coles will be talking to us about ancient mulberry trees of London and the Morus Londinium project. And as far as I'm concerned, mulberry trees, one of the best tree species going. Absolutely fascinating, stunning trees. So before we start over, just a quick couple of points on housekeeping. We really love doing quick Q&A at the end, so please put any questions you have into the Q&A panel rather than the chat, because if it's in the chat, it's a bit more difficult for me to find all the questions. And if you do want to use the chat to say anything to fellow attendees, please select all panelists and attendees, otherwise it just comes to the panelists. We're scheduled to finish at 2 p.m, but I'll try and ask as many questions as I can, so we may go a minute or two over. And we're also recording this presentation, so again, it's something you can catch up on YouTube when it's posted there. But I'll disappear off screen and I'll hand over to our first presenter, David Humphries, to talk about the veteran and ancient trees of Hampstead Heath. Over to you, David.
Everyone see the screen okay?
Yep, all good to go.
Great. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm here to talk about the place where I work, which is Hampstead Heath. It's run by the City of London Corporation Open Spaces Department, and particularly going to talk about the veteran and a few ancient trees that we have there. So Hampstead Heath is a large open space. Many of you probably already know it, but it's 6 kilometres from the heart of the capital. We have approximately 25,000 trees, and at the last head count, we had about 10 million visits a year. Although last year, as I'll talk about a little later on in this presentation, that increased probably by 50% on the year. Images here show what it's like today, a lot of secondary woodland, but also from Constable's time, when John Constable lived in the area. There's an image here of what is that shows the heath denuded of trees. It was grazed quite heavily. But since the grazing stopped in the 1950s, the secondary woodland has encroached and grown quite rapidly on the heath. So just a quick show of where we are in terms of what the City of London manages. Circled in red here is Hampstead Heath and North London open spaces, which are Highgate Woods, Hampstead Heath and Queen's Park. You can see in the centre there's City Gardens, which is literally the square mile of the city. In the east we have Epping Forest and West Ham Park. The west we have Burnham Beeches and the Stoke Common, and in the south all the southern commons, including Ashted and Riddlesdown, and you can see in the map there. This year marks the 150th anniversary of Hampstead Heath, or the Hampstead Heath Act, which was set up to preserve the heath for the people. And we'll be celebrating that this year numerously throughout the year with various events. Some imagery here to show again the difference in the site and how it's transformed over the time. You can see the sheep grazing in the image in the top left-hand corner there, with one of the veteran trees, which probably sadly I don't think is there anymore. And today you can see the sheep are people. It's us. There's a lot of users of the heath. The bottom two images show an avenue of London planes that were planted approximately 1900, and you can see those planes today. They're probably planted too closely together and they've caused themselves a lot of issues with lack of light and various other issues. So I mentioned we have 25,000 trees. The veterans of the heath and a small number of ancients. I mean, we only have probably half a dozen, 10 ancient trees in total, but about 480 veteran trees, and these are made up across species. Majority are quercus, oak, and they're split between maidens and pollards. We have beech, coppice and maidens, Silvus torminalis, the wild service. One or two of those are possibly ancients. They're very old trees on the site. Field maples, hornbeams, hawthorn, pears, crabs, and some old yews and ash as well. These four examples show typical veteran trees on the heath. An example of an isolated veteran tree that we manage, we have a site over in Brent called Queen's Park, and you can see in this image a small pollarded oak tree. In the map in the left-hand corner, you can see it before the encroachment of all the London going into Kilburn and Cricklewood. You can see in the map there from 1865. This is the last remnant of a hedgerow. It now sits within that urban Victorian park. So when the park was laid out, they maintained this and one other veteran oak tree within the park, and it's still there, suffering from compaction and overtopping by big plane trees. So light and nutrients and water are a bit of an issue, an ongoing issue for this particular tree. Back to the heath. We set up with volunteers, our Heath Hands volunteers, a survey of the Heath's veteran trees in 2002 to record what we had as a database, a baseline data set of the veteran trees on the heath. And that involved 40 members of the Heath Hands volunteer group, and they were trained with the SSM in 2002, and there were 7 individual small groups, and they were split out into 9 areas using the old maps that showed the majority of the ancient or veteran trees, the hedgerow trees. So they were looking at all the different characteristics that the trees had that made them veterans, and they recorded them on a database. And that was finished in 2004. And I think we had somewhere like about 800 trees that were tagged and recorded as veteran trees. And we placed some microchips into those trees so that we could have an ongoing record of the tree number for the survey. We revisited the survey, the veteran tree survey, over a 3-year period starting in 2017 by the in-house tree team at Hampstead. We have a 4-person tree team of arborists, conservation-based arborists who do tree inspection, veteran tree management, and tree healthcare. And we went back out looking at the veteran trees to see a health check, give a health check on the trees that were identified back in 2002. And there was a mortality rate, but the mortality rate is relatively low. So we have lost some of those veteran trees, but we've also reclassified because we feel that some of the veteran trees were probably just very mature trees and not quite veterans. They didn't have the veteran features that we would attribute to being veterans. So we've reclassified, and we're down to about 500 trees, and we'd lost something like about 25 veteran trees in that intervening period of 15 years. But we've also added new trees that were left off that list. So tree species, small tree species like hawthorn and alder and a few others were added to widen the tree species list of our veterans. And so we've been assessing the mortality ongoing. The trees are tagged and they're plotted onto GIS, and this map shows all the oak trees that we class as veterans, and they're color coded by their girth size. Although it's very small in this image, you can see that the girths range from 1.5 to over 6 meters in girth, and we only have a very small amount of oak trees in excess of 6 meters. I think the largest is about 620, 625, something like that, which in terms of open grown veteran oaks, that would take you into ancient tree territory, but we only have a small number of those. But I do feel that the last 100 years, a lot of our trees have stunted in their growth. Although they're viable and they're vascular and they're relatively healthy, they're not getting quite the energy they need, the light, nutrients in the soil, access to hydration, to really put on decent growth rings. And I think a lot of our veterans probably don't have the girth that they could have had they been in less compacted areas. We have an ancient tree trail, veteran tree trail that we set up with the Ancient Tree Forum a couple of years ago. And we've put this together so it's like a self-guided trail, so that members of the public can go out and walk the trail themselves and find 17 of our veteran trees and how we manage them. So looking at all the different types of management around veteran trees, like haloing surrounding canopies to open up the light, and also closing down pathways where people are walking on the roots of the veteran trees. So you can download this from the Ancient Tree Forum or the City of London site, and it's downloadable onto your mobile phones and your apps, so you can do a self-guided tour. But we also use this to carry out small group tours as well, with professionals from the UK and across Europe. We do get a lot of failures. Today is not not a usual day, but we've got strong winds today, and we've lost probably 2 or 3 major limbs off some of our old pollarded oaks, and that's just today. So ongoing, we do get tree failures amongst our veterans and ancients. These failures can be root failures, they can be lapsed pollard head failures, where the big, long, lapsed poles that become trees like themselves, heavily weighted on decayed bollings, do split out, and also just maiden trees that have huge amounts of decay. I'm going to quickly go through a few examples of how we manage individual trees. The tree here is probably the most iconic tree on the Heath. We call it the hollow beech, and it is a beech tree that is hollow, surprise, surprise. Completely hollow up to the top of its canopy. The canopy basically split out in 1987 during that great storm we had, and reiterated a new canopy. The tree's probably at 250, 270 years old, so certainly a veteran, taking it possibly into the ancient realm for a beech tree. And because it's reiterated a new canopy since 1987, this tree is quite exposed to wind load, but also lack of light at the same time. So we have to halo prune the surrounding canopies of the younger trees around there to get light to the canopy of this tree, but also mindful of not overexposing it to too much light, because beech scorch if you open up too much light, very thin bark species, but also to increase wind load on what are relatively weakly attached branches or new canopy reiterations. So about every 5 years we work on this tree in terms of reducing. Later on in this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the soil management around this tree. So the crown reduction involves getting up there basically and reducing the height of the canopy, trying not to take too much photosynthetic material off, but at the same time letting light into the canopy, so that more lower down epicormic growth can develop by having access to light. Another example here, example 2, we call Two Tree Hill, which is quite self-explanatory. It used to be, excuse me, 2 trees on a hill, and the hill was caused by sand mining. It's on the highest point of the Heath, one of the highest points in London, which is on bag shot sand, very high up, and was used and excavated for sand for the development of the railways and for housing as London expanded. You can see these images, the 2 left-hand black and white images taken from about 1890, show the 2 trees are very isolated. The middle lower image shows today's satellite view of those 2 trees, and you can see that they've become heavily encroached by what were planted trees back in about 1900, mostly all oak, but the trees, the 2 veteran trees, are certainly 400, 500 years old, are become encroached in terms of their light. So we halo prune this as well. This is a long-term ongoing piece of work where we're slowly opening up the canopy, and you can see in the bottom right-hand corner here where you can see the light around the 2 old trees' canopies. Off the Heath, we also have great honour really to go over to assist our colleagues over at Burnham Beeches every year for the last 14 years, where we've been asked to help them with their management, the canopy management of their extremely veteran, ancient, in a lot of cases, pollarded beech trees. These are incredibly fragile ecosystems that require delicate reduction work sometimes, but also again more halo pruning. And we have a lot of challenges involved in working with these trees because they are incredibly decayed through their longevity, their age, and the cutting that for the pollarding, for the poles that they used to use, would induce decay into these trees. The bottom left-hand image is a resistor graph of this particular pumpkin pollard, they call it, so the road's called Pumpkin Lane, that shows blue spike there is the only solid wood, and the rest of the tree is completely hollow. So a relatively unstable tree next to a roadside, and a very difficult tree to actually get into to work because it's so fragile. So we actually put a high line spanning across the top of the tree, which is tethered to 2 other maiden trees either side of it, and our climbers work off that tether. So we're keeping our weight off the canopy of that tree. So that, again, although it has a very healthy vascular system, you can tell that by the amount of green foliage on there, again, they're very weakly attached, so we can't put a lot of weight onto those trees. An example of maintaining, this is back at Golders Hill Park in Hampstead Heath, and maintaining a line of veteran oak trees, which are within a deer field. There's a zoo at Golders Hill Park, and again, the soil is sandy, so the roots of the trees struggle here with the wind, and 2 of the trees in this line at different times were showing signs of collapsing and falling over. 25 years ago, when I first started, I moved away from horticulture and moved into arboriculture after the big storm. We cleared everything up that fell down because we had older Victorian kind of principles where parks had to be cleared up, no dead wood, no dead trees, not a great mindset for maintaining biodiversity with these trees, even if they're fallen down. These 2 trees fell down very, very slowly, and it gave us the opportunity not only to move the target around the trees, because there used to be a public footpath inside where the trees fell, but also the fence line used to be the other side of those trees. So we moved the fence line out and moved the path away, but we just left the trees and put soil on top of the exposed root plates. And 10 years on, they're both living quite happily as reclining trees within that line of boundary old hedgerow oak trees, which are veterans. But I think we planted 1 tree in there where we lost one possibly about five years ago, that completely root separated. So that had no chance of surviving. But we've replaced that with another oak tree to keep the line of oaks going. Standing dead wood is a very, very important habitat. We have about 75 what we used to class as monoliths, but they're dead standing trees that we manage and maintain as standing as much as we can. So periodically, well, we inspect them every year, but we reduce them when we feel they're becoming too unstable. They're incredibly important because they host a huge array of saprophytic species, bats and mammals as well, which because we have a reducing veteran tree population number, the habitat for these incredibly important species is diminishing slowly over time. So this helps bridge the gap until our younger trees, which sometimes we veteranize, but sometimes as they get older, they become veterans through storm damage, until they're ready to host the niche species that are associated with deadwood and hollows and decay. We maintain this standing deadwood population as a bridging gap between the veterans and the younger cohort trees. So we have about 75 of these on the heath. They're mapped, they're inspected. They do fall over. It depends on the species that you keep standing. Willow and the diffuse spore species aren't great for longevity, so they don't last standing very long. You may get 5 or 10 years out of them, but the oaks can stand for decades. As long as you manage the weight in terms of decay and gravity, then these can stand for a very, very long time. Some of the issues, some of the threats and abuse we have to veteran trees at Hampstead. These images show examples of biological, cultural and site management issues. So biological issues would be pest and disease. So oak processionary moth would have been deemed as a risk to our veteran trees. I'm not actually sure that is the case. Actually, on Hampstead Heath, this is maybe for another time, another discussion, but our OPM population is decreasing currently over the last 2 or 3 years. We have a taconid fly that's parasitising the OPM. So OPM is not particularly an ongoing issue for our veteran trees. What is a big issue is oak mildew. So the bottom left-hand image shows the fungus, the leaf fungus, oak mildew, and that causes a lack of photosynthesis due to the film of the fungi on the leaf. And that is an ongoing health issue for our veterans, along with all the other issues that the trees have to deal with, like compaction and drought and other pests and disease. Moving on to the cultural damage, we get graffiti sadly on our trees, and that can be just people marking up the trees with ink and paint, but also using knives to cut into the bark of our trees and create arbor-glyphs, or almost like hieroglyphs. But also dog damage. Dog damage increases massively in our urban areas, not only on the streets, but in the parks and in the urban open spaces. The top middle image here shows bark damage caused by dogs, which is a human problem. It's not really the dog issue. It's how humans deal with their dogs and lack of respect of the trees around them. Some of these site management issues that the trees have to deal with are big events on the heath, because we have such a high footfall. There's also large events like cross-country events that cause additional compaction around the roots of trees, and big land projects. We had a big rebuild of our dams 5 years ago across the heath, where a lot of heavy plant was brought onto the heath, and we had to find ways to protect the roots of the trees. So these are examples of our ongoing abuse and threats to the veterans. To help with that, we look at our veteran tree healthcare, and that takes up probably about 30 to 40% of our time, where we're improving the health conditions and identifying structural and vascular issues with our veteran trees. The top left-hand image here shows a compost tea application, a foliar compost tea application to one of our veteran oaks called the bandstand oak, which is trying to improve the health of the canopy by spraying foliar compost tea, which has additives in there which combat things like oak mildew. We also do soil sampling, but probably, quite honestly, not enough. a major way of managing veteran trees and understanding veteran trees is understanding what's going on in the soil, in the root environment, and assessing the hydration levels, the compaction levels, and the nutrient levels, the micronutrient levels in the soil. And this is a program that we'd like to increase going on into the future from this point onwards, particularly on the back end of the pandemic and the increase in footfall around our veteran trees over the last year. To help recover the soil around our veteran trees, we've gone into a process of fencing off a lot of our veterans, and not individual trees, but areas, groups of areas of veteran trees. The Heath is an area that we don't really want to fence off. It goes against some of the principles of the Hampstead Heath Act, where we're not allowed to really enclose the site. But we're getting to this point where if we don't protect the roots and the soil of the veteran trees, then we will be losing our veteran trees ongoing. And that mortality rate will just increase, sadly. So we've decided to erect and install temporary, semi-temporary stock fencing. This is mostly to keep the desire lines that are increasing into our woodland by the increased numbers of the public and dogs having free access in and around the veteran trees. Going back to the Hollow Beech, one of the issues at the Hollow Beech is, again, because it's such an iconic local, well-loved tree, it has a lot of people come to visit it. Over the generations of families, grandparents, parents and children and their children come back to see this tree. It's heavily compacted soil. Although the tree's in relatively good health, it will be going into decline. There are symptoms in the canopy that show this to us. So we've remediated this by decompacting this, what should be quite light, fluffy, sandy soil. In reality is concrete. It's got a very dense, thick crust where the soil nutrients struggle to get through, and water struggle to get through the compaction. So these images show the decompaction around the Hollow Beech, where we vertically mulched the soil with an air spade, and we backfilled with decomposing wood chip, locally sourced decomposing wood chip. And then we forked over the remaining area in between the vertical mulches just to break that compaction manually, and also laid a mulch layer. It's quite important not to lay a deep mulch layer on, because that can add to compaction conditions, the weight of the mulch with water, but also it can create a pan. So it's quite important, although you're trying to add nutrients to the soil, not to overload and put too much there. We're also fencing off these trees and trying to be relatively subtle about it. So we don't want to stop people going up to this tree because it's so iconic, but we also want to make it quite clear that this is a very special tree, and that we would prefer people not to go en masse up to this tree and continue compacting the soil. We're also in the process of creating new pollards at the site. Hampstead Heath isn't quite like our sister sites at Burnham Beeches and Epping Forest, where they've got literally thousands of pollards, or Burnham hundreds of pollards. But a large number of our veteran trees, of the 500 veteran trees, were pollards that have become lapsed. And we've instigated creating a lot of new pollards on the Heath. And we're starting to map these and put them into a cycle of repollarding. This again will be a way of looking at the historic way that old trees were managed on the Heath, but in terms of providing an ongoing legacy of understanding what the Heath trees would have looked like, and also the biodiversity benefits that will come with declining, decaying, hollowing, pollarded trees in the future, which provide great biodiversity. We're also looking at improving the genetic stock of some of the trees that we have on the Heath, and where we can, we're moving saplings from other areas, from older trees, onto the Heath. And a really good example of this is that we have a sapling from the King Offers oak at Windsor Great Park, which the tree's somewhere in the region of 1,000 years old, a fantastic, resilient, old, ancient oak tree. And a good few hundred of these trees were developed as saplings, and we got one or two of these and have planted them out onto the Heath. And it'd be very interesting to watch how this tree develops over the next few decades in comparison to our oak trees and the saplings. Important part of our work so that we can understand the best value of working with veteran trees is sharing our ideas and also learning and gaining knowledge from further afield. So we do a lot of outreach to colleagues across Europe, in Poland, in Spain, and Italy, and we have exchange ideas and work experience for ARBs coming to Hampstead and Burnham, to share these ideas, but also ourselves going over there and learning from mistakes and good practice over on the continent. Obviously not for the last year or so, but we're hoping to get back onto that work. Very important aspects for continued professional development in ancient and veteran tree management. I haven't put a slide in today, but one of the slides we sometimes talk about is an ongoing training program across Europe called VetCert, which is a certificate system developed here in the UK, but also in Belgium and Poland and other places in Europe, where we're trying to create a benchmark standard for consultative and practical veteran tree work. So there's 2 levels of VetCert certification at those 2 levels. I'm going to wrap up now because I need to give some time to our other speaker, but also leave time for some questions at the end. But I just wanted to highlight some of the references that we use and other authorities that we interact with. So there's Woodland Trust, the Ancient Tree Forum, TreeWorks Environmental Practice. Neville Fay is a bit of a mentor of ours, comes and visits us every year at Hampstead, has opened a lot of doors for us. But we utilize these 2 seminal books, Common Sense Risk Management of Trees, which literally says what it does on the tin, not being too risk averse with our management, and also David Lonsdale's Ancient and Other Veteran Trees, Further Guidance on Management. Both of these are available online. So I'm going to close there. Thank you for your time. Hope you've learned something and happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, David. Fascinating stuff. Also, those 2 publications that David mentioned, they're also available as free PDFs online, and absolutely brilliant books. Really recommend it. And yeah, Hampstead Heath, one of my favourite places. Really recommend you go visit if you're nearby. Yeah, I'll go straight over to Peter Coles. Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much, David. Just to say that a lot of the trees are very familiar to me. I live about 8 minutes away from Golders Hill Park and about 15 from Hampstead Heath, and I really enjoy walking there. And I also know from personal experience, having been on a walk with David, that he seems to know just about every tree on Hampstead Heath. And thank you for a lovely talk. I'm not an arboriculturist. I am more of a kind of historian, I suppose, of trees, with a special interest in mulberry trees. When we're talking about mulberry trees and talking about ancient mulberry trees, which was originally going to be the title of my talk, I thought, well, there aren't really any ancient mulberry trees for all kinds of reasons, but there are some veteran mulberry trees, and there are a number of heritage mulberry trees, which is kind of an odd category, but it's one that I'm perhaps more familiar with, and it's trees, especially in the London area, Greater London area, that have some historical significance or connection. And that's very much what the Morus Londinium website, which I set up with the Conservation Foundation in 2016 with Heritage Lottery funding, is about. It's about, it was a public survey, as I'll mention in a moment, using an interactive map, and where members of the public would submit records of any mulberry trees they knew of any age. It might be one they bought this year and planted, but also mulberry trees that they knew of that were much older. And the reason for doing that is that we knew of a certain number of old mulberry trees. These are quite well documented. They're associated with old houses, for example, like 16th, 17th century houses. But there are a number of other mulberry trees that are now in people's gardens, their parks and so on, where the land use around them has changed, very much like the one in Queen's Park that David showed, which was part of a hedgerow and is now in the middle of a park. And this survey has revealed some of those, and I hope to share some of those with you. Now, when we're talking about, say, very old, and very old in mulberry terms can be anything over 200 years, with a few trees in the Greater London area that are over 300 and even fewer that may be 400 years old. We're not talking about maiden trees. We're not talking about trees that are just upright and that fit the kind of stereotype of what we associate with a veteran or heritage a veteran or an ancient tree. Mulberry trees, like many other deciduous trees, do layer. They tend to fall over, and their branches, when they hit the ground, will put down their own roots, and they will then start to grow up. The branches will grow up as what appear to be new stems. So when you see an old mulberry tree, a very old mulberry tree, this one is in the background of my title slide, is in the orchard of Syon House. And that orchard has well, it could date back to the late 15th century, the 1400s. And I have copies of bills from the accounts of the archives of Syon House showing the purchase of mulberry trees for 1604. So we know that some of the trees can have a provenance which dates back to 400 years and possibly 450 years. And they are not these upright trees. They are what looks, as I say, like grove of trees. And as I show you some of the older trees in the London area and a little bit beyond, that's one of the points that I'm trying to make, I suppose, that they don't really have the form that we tend to associate with a very old tree. So London's mulberries, and that's England's and to some extent Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. The timeline is really that they first came to England. They're not native trees. They came over with the Romans in the 1st century, and they continued to be grown on a very small scale for their fruit in the first few centuries during the Roman occupation. Then we know little about what happened after that. But we do know from records and the few records that exist, and the fact that there are Anglo-Saxon words for mulberry, murrey, for example, the colour murrey, and a drink that's made with mulberry and honey, that they were also a feature of some medieval gardens. We also know that they were grown in monasteries, which of course were Catholic monasteries, and there was a certain amount of traffic between France and Italy and Spain of abbots and monks, and they would have had experience of mulberries growing in monasteries there, and would have perhaps brought back either cuttings or seeds or possibly even young trees. That's less likely, I suppose. But we know that they were grown in monasteries in Britain for fruit and shade. They were also mentioned in and are still found in association with some Tudor houses. Now, some of these houses were inherited from monasteries during the dissolution of the monasteries, where some of the aristocrats of the land were given houses that were once, or given property that were once monasteries, where they either preserved the monastery or they converted it and built a house there, like Syon House, for example. And any old trees they may have kept for all kinds of reasons. That is the case for Syon, and they are sometimes these monasteries included orchards in their infirmary gardens. The next area was James I, next time with his silk project, which I'll come back to in a moment. And then during the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, they were planted in gardens for their fruit and shade. In the 19th century, a lot of parks were created, sometimes where there had been previous large houses, and mulberry trees were planted there. Very often you get these kind of arboreta where you have like one of every species, and one of the species that people like to plant them during the 19th century sort of parks movement were mulberry trees. So you have quite a few 150-year-old mulberry trees in parks. And they continue to be planted for their fruit, landscape and shade and so on. When I'm talking about mulberry trees here, we're really talking about Morus nigra, the black mulberry. This one is very near to me in West Hampstead Cemetery. They come originally from around the Caspian Sea, what used to be the Persian Empire, now Iran, but also commonly found in other areas like Azerbaijan and into Greece, Sicily and southern Italy. And then later on, it also introduced by the Romans into France, and by the Arabs, actually, as it happened, into Spain. And gradually, also there are a few in Germany and Sweden and so on that also came there, generally with the Romans. I won't go into too much about this. The mulberry tree is very odd and it doesn't hybridize. It has an extraordinarily high number of chromosomes. Unlike the 308, I think it is, which is like an awful lot more than usually. The contrary to what people usually think, the black mulberry leaves were actually used to feed silkworms until the white mulberry arrived from China. Now, we're talking about black mulberries here because all old mulberry trees, except this one, I think, as far as I know anyway, in England, are black mulberries. This is in the Oxford Botanic Garden. It's about 200 and something years old, about 1799. And it's possibly the oldest white mulberry in the country. These are the ones that are grown to feed silkworms, where the leaves have a kind of an ancient, not even some symbiosis, actually. They're parasitized by the silk moth. I won't really be talking about those. Now, I've said that the mulberries came over with the Romans, and there aren't any Roman trees still in existence. But the watershed moment for the introduction of mulberry trees was James I in 1607, where he wanted to start a silk industry to compete with those of, well, not necessarily to compete, but to mean that we didn't have to buy silk thread or silk from Italy, Spain, and France, or even China for that matter. He ordered thousands, tens of thousands of black and white mulberry trees to be planted in the grounds of stately homes, so the homes of landowners, large landowners. But the project didn't work for all kinds of reasons. Well, we were going through a little ice age, the weather wasn't suitable, and also nobody could be bothered, really. They take a long time to grow, especially if you plant black mulberries, maybe 15 years or something. People got fed up. Virginia was on the horizon for James I, much more suited to growing and planting mulberry trees for a silk industry. He exported or imported into Virginia hundreds of thousands of white mulberry trees, and the silk industry did take off there, and it basically just filtered out here. But what we did have as a result of that is a whole legacy of black mulberry trees. Not white mulberry trees. Why? Partly because they probably didn't live that long, and secondly because they're less interesting, and perhaps even thirdly because it may have been that male trees were selected and planted. Now, the mulberry tree, I had once had a radio program on Radio 4 with an interview with Roger Saul, who founded the Mulberry sort of fashion luxury company. And he was asked why he chose the name Mulberry for his company. And he said, well, we were looking for something that conjured up Englishness. And I know he went to school in Bath, where there was a mulberry tree, which is also where the Mulberry Harbours were built, and that's possibly why they got that name. The Admiralty occupied the buildings of this public school that had an old mulberry tree in the grounds. But it was very interested by this notion that the mulberry conjures up this notion of Englishness. And you see from this illustration by George Cruikshank that does appear to be the case. And the famous botanist, the Scottish botanist John Claudius Loudon, said that as a result of James I's silk industry, where mulberry trees were planted in the grounds of stately homes of the aristocracy and then weren't used to produce silk but were kept for their fruit, that there is scarcely an old garden or gentlemancy throughout the country which can be traced back to the 17th century in which a mulberry tree is not to be found, which is kind of optimistic in a way, because it means that there are some old mulberry trees that could be sort of 300 to 400 years old around the country, and now we know that that's the case. And if you look around in London, you'll find one such example at Charlton House, and this is directly linked to James I's project. This house, Charlton House, was built for the tutor to his son, Prince Henry. And the tree was planted in about 1611, and it's still there. You can visit it. And the Morus Londinium project has installed a certain amount of detailed information around the tree. Down the road in Deptford, there's another tree, which is a bit later, 1650s, and that's on the site of a house that was lived in by John Evelyn, the diarist and the author of Silver, that famous treatise on forest trees. And he actually produced a map which does have an X on it. This is John Evelyn produced this map, and it has an X marking the spot of a mulberry tree. This is what his house looked like. There are other mulberry trees that are associated with the James I project. This one's in Christ's College, Cambridge, and it's known as Milton's mulberry because Milton went to university there, although he didn't plant it, and he may have sat under it, but it would have been about 20 years old when he was there, so it wouldn't have been a very big tree. Now, why is it this really weird shape? We know that it wasn't a couple of hundred years ago because this is the same tree. And it seems very likely that this technique of mounding was used to encourage the branches of the existing stems to layer and to continue growing and finding their nutrients. We know other trees that don't have this mounding that were date to the same time. It just basically, they look like a bag of bones, really. They're hollowed out and they are well, they're still producing leaves, so they're vigorous in that sense, but they don't really look like massive trees. Now, the Morus Londinium project, as I said, we invited Londoners and those further afield to tell us our trees. We started off with about 20 in our database, and we now have over 750. Some of these are very young, but some of them are also old, and some of them have come to light since as a result of this project. They're not associated with houses that we've known about for a long time. They're exactly the ones that we were interested in finding. Now, there is a great problem in dating veteran mulberry trees. So what you really need is context. The Archie Miles, the great dendrologist, once dated a tree as being about in Suffolk as being about 300 years old, only to be told by the owner that it was planted on his birth 64 years previously. So they tend to look old when they're not. And so what we need very often is context. Some of the usual measurements like girth and so on and height aren't going to work so well. Now, this one is in Fountain Court in the Middle Temple. It looks old. It's one of 4, of which 3 survive, I think, or 2 survive. And you can see what they look like in around 1900. And we know that they were planted for the Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee in 1886. And I use trees like this where we have a known date of planting as a kind of reference so that I don't go too off scale when I'm trying to estimate the age of a tree. We have Hogarth's house. I've just come from a delightful conversation with the manager of Hogarth's house. And this is very likely a remnant of an orchard that was on the site in the 1670s. And Hogarth built his house in 1713, I think, and 1717, something like that. And does make reference to the mulberry tree. It's showing signs of a veteran tree of hollowing out and so on, but it's still a very vigorous tree. We have records of it going back. This one's not very long ago, but even older than that. We have another one in West Square near to Elephant and Castle, Waterloo, where we know that I'm pretty sure that it was laid out as one of 4 trees, black mulberry trees in around 1799. And like most mulberry trees, they tend to lean over and then they collapse. They need to be propped up. And this one is no exception. One of them is gone. We've got 3 left. And there are several white mulberries that are young. You can see these around here. But they're being very well looked after by, I think it's Southwark Council. Preacher's Court Charter House, which was obviously a monastery, but this particular mulberry inside, which I believe has lost a limb, but I haven't been back there to see it, was a donation of as a cutting, I think, from the Milton Mulberry in Cambridge in around 1840. Dulwich Picture Gallery, we have another one. This one is it's getting to be one of the older trees in London that is still upright. Hidden away behind some of the beautiful residences on Chiswick Mall, but along by the Thames, you have 1 or 2 trees that are also still upright that we know date back to the 1700s. There's a doubt about the London Chest Hospital mulberry, which has its roots in Bishop Bonner's palace from the 1500s. it's unlikely that this tree is actually from the 1500s, but we don't yet know, and it's contested. Developers want to move it and so on. So it's a kind of political hot potato. There's a judicial review which hasn't decided yet whether it can be moved or whether it's too dangerous to move. One of the reasons for not moving it is its heritage value as an ancient tree, but I wouldn't want to put a date on it. But it could be a scion, it could be a phoenix tree that's arisen from roots of a much older tree. London's oldest mulberry tree is one like this, not this one, but there's a pip actually, which is held by the Museum of London, which comes from a waterlogged site, Roman site, by what was New Fresh Wharf, which is right by London Bridge, the old London Bridge. So we know that they were here. And there are traces of mulberry trees that are associated with monasteries. I'm going to go fairly quickly. Lesnes Abbey has one. This again doesn't date to 1178. There was a farm on the site. It may have belonged to that, but it may have been one that's quite old. Morus Niagara at Scion House Orchard. These are amongst, if not, I think, possibly the oldest mulberries in London. And they do date back to at least 1604, but maybe a bit earlier to the 1450s and 60s, when the Brigittine monastery was there. The mulberry tree you've just seen is about here, just about here. We can see my cursor. We know by I've done some GPS plots and so on, and then used it with GIS referencing to old maps, and that's where it is located. So it is likely to be a vestige of that. The remnants of the orchard, which is not open to the public, is really quite an extraordinary place. Some of the trees are younger, and some of them are just completely disintegrated. All the heartwood is gone, and what you're left is like a circle of stems that look really old. Look like a grove of trees, whereas in fact genetically they're all the same tree. Other Tudor mulberry trees are likely to look the same. This one's in Groton Winthrop in Suffolk. This is down the road in Edwardstone in a private garden. Hatfield House has one possibly planted by John Tradescant in about 1611, and this was a pollard. And that looks very much like some of the veteran trees you see of other species. There's no remnant of this, unfortunately, King Henry VIII. This was his house. Down the road, there are no trees left where there were. There's a claim that this was Thomas More's tree from the 1500s, but it's very unlikely to be actually that old. But it could be a phoenix tree. This was the grounds, and it's standing about here where the middle of the house would have been. I'm going to go quite quickly. Canonbury Tower in Highbury is a Tudor tower. It's quite remarkable. It's a skyscraper in Islington, and at the back is a collapsed mulberry tree, which again is quite likely to be as old. Francis Bacon lived here, may have been associated with its planting in around 1600. I call these lost angels because lost angels from a ruined paradise is a phrase from, is a line from a poem by Shelley, paradise meaning a garden. And these trees have their roots in gardens that have long disappeared under development. This is behind a vicarage in Lewisham. This is in Belsize Terrace in Belsize Park, and is likely to be part of the original. This is part of a silk farm planted in 1700 in Chelsea. This is in the gardens of some flats. Mulberry Walk. This tree unfortunately gave its name to the street it's in. The owner of the house who owned the tree wanted to cave out their basement, had the tree chopped down. Streatham Park has some other trees that were associated with Dr. Johnson, and there were 3 of them that were in the grounds. Unfortunately, strong winds did take down one of the limbs and it went, but apparently it's growing shoots. So the Morus Londinium map is where to go if you want to find more of these trees. There are lots of them, too many to talk about here. But that's given you a little bit of a glimpse, and I'm just going to hand you back to Greg, and hopefully we can go over a little bit for questions if necessary.
Thank you very much, Peter. Yeah, as I said before, I absolutely love old mulberry trees, so it's always fascinating hearing about them. And if anybody ever goes to the Fountain Courts at the Middle Temple outside the City of London, I'm convinced that the mulberries are the same age, roughly, as the huge London plane trees right next to it. It's quite fascinating to see the difference in size. But yeah, so please put the questions into the Q&A box. We can ask a couple, but I'll start with David. This is 2 questions I can combine as one. Could you quickly explain the difference between veteran and ancient trees, and is there an age to be considered as veteran or ancient?
Short answer is no. Can't quickly describe that, but yeah. So an ancient tree is a tree that's gone beyond its maturity. So it's very species dependent. So take oak, for example. Oaks grow for the first 200 years as young, developing, mature trees, and then they mature into the next 2 or 3 centuries. And then anything beyond that, 400 or 500 onwards, they're getting beyond maturity. So they're not growing up anymore. They're growing down, basically. They're getting very decayed, very large, wide girths. And that's a fair description of an ancient tree. But ancient trees can be much younger. So again, species dependent. So hawthorns, we've got ancient hawthorns possibly on the Heath, which don't have massive girths on them, but are remnants of very, very old hedgerows. Veterans, again, very, very species dependent, but veteran trees are really about the habitat potential, the features that they hold, which tell a story about their life. So whether they've been part of storm damage or been reduced vigor through in other environmental factors, have decayed branches, hollows, cracks, cavities. But birch trees, 50, 60-year-old birch trees can be veteran trees if they have hollows and cavities. So veterans are really about the habitat potential. Ancients really about their age and size and diminishing size, in a nutshell.
Great, I think that's a very comprehensive answer. Peter, to be caught red-handed from a mulberry tree, is it true, that saying? Does it really come from mulberry trees?
I know it's one of your favourites, that one, Greg.
It is very much.
And you know that we differ on this one. As far as I understand, I did do a little bit of research on it. The phrase actually goes back to perhaps the 1500s or maybe earlier, and where there were so few trees, mulberry trees in the country, that it wouldn't have made sense to have a phrase that nobody would have had any experience of. So I think it's much more like to do with having blood on your hands than it is having mulberry trees, because nobody would have known when the phrase was being in use what that meant, what a mulberry tree was. So unlikely, but I like the story, and if you want to carry on with it, I don't mind. I won't object.
Well, as they say, never let the truth get in the way of a good story.
Exactly.
So we've had a comment from Conchita. In the past hour on Twitter, they're reporting that the Bethnal Green mulberry has actually been saved from the developers at the judicial review, which...
Oh, what an amazing way to announce it. That's really a beautiful news.
Fantastic timing. And one from Vivian. When new mulberry trees are planted, is there a preference for white or black mulberry?
Well, it depends what you're planting them for. If you're planting them for your fruit, you want black mulberries. If you're planting them to grow silkworms, you want white mulberries. If you're planting them as a street tree, you might want a male white mulberry. But if you're planting them for shade and for their beauty as trees that are going to look old really quite soon, perhaps when they're 40, 50 years old, then you would plant black mulberries. They're messy though. They need quite a bit of space, and they will leave their fruit and black stains all over your lawn or wherever, or your car, or wherever it happens to be planted near. But white mulberries don't live as long. They have a certain aesthetic value, but it's not generally what is appreciated really in this country. They tend to be black mulberries.
Yeah, I mean, I know that we tend to plant black mulberries more so. Although I've never actually come across white mulberry as a street tree, so I'd be really interested to see that. But,
there are some. Ask Paul. Paul
I'll have to check them out.
In Hackney, I believe.
Of course, it's Hackney. David, you mentioned at the start about the dramatic increase in visitors this year. Something that I think we've seen across quite a few parks in London. But is there anything you could say about the impact it's having on tree health long term, that deluging increase of visitors?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. That we don't really know, actually. I think it's quite obvious that there's been a huge increase in footfall and all the associated issues with massive increase in people. So littering, big numbers of new dog walkers as well, and the issues around dogs and fouling into the soil around veteran trees. The soil analysis that I spoke of earlier, I think that's critically important for ourselves at Hampstead, but right across the open spaces. I think we need to understand the state of the soil as it is now, and then monitor that soil ongoing into 5, 10, 15, 20 years, so we get a proper understanding of the legacy of the impacts of the increase in footfall numbers. But you'll know yourself, Greg, from the Royal Parks experience, just the increase in number of people over the last 10 years visiting our sites, incredibly important for people's mental well-being to have access to the sites. But the interpretation of what for them by us, what's happening to our trees, is critically important to get out there. We don't want to put signs up everywhere saying, please don't come near this veteran tree, you're going to kill it. But we need them to understand, sometimes subtly, that they will be having an impact. It's particularly, when I say we, I don't mean individual people, but masses of newcomers to our sites. So we need to monitor the soil basically and see what's going on.
That's great, thanks. Okay, a great one coming from Maureen Perry, which I think we'll probably have to have as the last question because we're just gone over 2 o'clock. Does pollarding harm trees? We see our street trees cut back so dramatically. Can all trees be pollarded, or only certain species?
Well, pollarding, really, the true technical term of pollarding was to create wood product on cycle of cutting every 5, 10, 15, 50 years for a need. So whether that be charcoal or boat building or house building. So in essence, that real term of pollarding has disappeared into our history. But I think you're talking about street pollarding, which is not true pollarding. It is cutting trees on cycle to maintain their size. That's all it's for. And some species can take pollarding, street pollarding very well. London plane arguably is one that does that very well. They can be cut on a very regular basis. And there are some species like lime particularly that doesn't take to regular cutting. It gets hollow, decayed quite rapidly. So it is species dependent, but also, again, it's a lot, all of this really goes back to its growing environment, its soil health, and whether or not the tree's got good access to air, nutrients and water.
Great, thank you. Yeah, had a comment come in. I wasn't sure who, it says anonymous attendee, just saying, as someone quite new and green to trees, how much they've enjoyed today's presentations and found it so informative. So yeah, I'd like to reiterate that. Just a big thank you, great presentations on 2 of my favourite subjects, old trees and mulberries. So yeah, big thank you from me, big thank you to everyone who's come, and just a reminder, check out the rest of the Urban Tree Festival. If you've enjoyed the Tree Rings webinar, have a look at our philosophical discussion about value of trees tomorrow. That should be really interesting. I don't know too much about it, but I'm very, very keen to find out more, as well as the importance of campaigning for trees. And we've just found out about how that mulberry tree at Bethnal Green has apparently been saved by a great campaign group. So I think that's a brilliant way to lead into Sunday's webinar. But yeah, thank you very much to everyone, and I'll end the webinar here. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks to our speakers as well.
Thank you.